$22 billion. Gone before sunrise. Not market volatility. Not sanctions. Not economic warfare in the conventional sense. 1,050 Iranian precision missiles found 10 of Israel's most classified underground gold bullion war reserves, the strategic wealth stockpiles that were supposed to fund military operations, stabilize currency, and keep the Israeli economy functional through the worst-case scenarios that defense planners had spent decades modeling, and reduce them to melted slag, incinerated currency stockpiles, and fractured bedrock in 28 minutes, while Netanyahu called an emergency crisis meeting and the IDF Economic Warfare Directorate discovered that 8% of the buried vaults remained intact. 8%. I have spent 32 years inside the classified system reviewing material that the public never sees. I have briefed the exact vulnerabilities that were exploited in the overnight operation to flag officers whose names I carry to my grave. And I am telling you, with the full professional weight of every year of that career pressing down on what I am about to say, that the after-action material that crossed my desk before dawn that April morning is not documenting a failure of intelligence. It is documenting a failure of institutional will to act on intelligence that was accurate, specific, and transmitted through the appropriate channels to the decision-makers whose procurement authority could have addressed it. The assessment I am describing was written before this happened. That sentence is not rhetorical framing. It is an operational fact whose precise implication I want to establish clearly before anything else. The scenario that played out in 28 minutes over central and northern Israel had been modeled. The vulnerability of underground economic reserve infrastructure to precision saturation strike had been identified, quantified, and documented in classified assessments that reached the relevant principles. The warnings were not missed. They were received, acknowledged, and then filed while competing institutional priorities continued to dominate the procurement decisions that left 10 gold bullion war reserves protected against the wrong threat profile. Iran absorbed the lesson from those warnings. The institutions that generated them moved on to other priorities. Let me take you inside exactly what happened, because the operational specifics are the argument, and the argument is more consequential than any official framing that has been applied to the same events. At 0431 local time, mobile transporter erector launchers dispersed across 5 western and central Iranian provinces received the synchronized launch order. The Salman family carries a 2,000-kilometer range and a 1,000-kilogram warhead section optimized for terminal maneuver and precision penetration against hardened underground targets. Solid fuel motors ignited in a staggered ripple whose timing architecture had been calibrated against the satellite coverage gap schedule that Iranian operational planners had spent months mapping against the overhead constellation windows. The first wave, 260 missiles, rose on extended range trajectories that exploited those gaps. Within 28 minutes, 10 secret gold bullion war reserves across central and northern Israel registered direct precision-guided impacts. These were not soft targets. They were facilities carved into mountain bedrock with reinforced concrete vaults, layered blast doors, EMP shielding, built to specifications developed for infrastructure whose survival was considered essential to national warfighting economic capacity, and redundant climate control systems maintaining the environmental stability that bullion storage and currency reserve integrity require. The entire physical and engineering architecture of these facilities was built around a single institutional assumption, that their locations were protected by the combination of hardening and the targeting difficulty that made precise strike against classified underground economic infrastructure impossible without classified collection capability. That assumption was wrong, and Iran had been documenting that it was wrong, patiently, methodically, through commercial satellite imagery and open-source geospatial analysis for years before the first Salman missile left its launcher. Subscribe right now if you are 2 minutes into this and you are beginning to understand that the overnight destruction of 10 Israeli gold bullion war reserves is not primarily a story about Iranian long-range strike capability. It is a story about the specific gap between institutional warning and institutional action, and the cost that gap produces when it is measured not in budget line items, but in $22 billion of strategic wealth reduced to melted slag and incinerated currency reserves in the time it takes to watch a film. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with me. Because the exchange ratio I am about to walk you through makes the institutional failure's cost visible in terms that no defense budget discussion can obscure. Each Salman missile represented an Iranian outlay of roughly $650,000 on average. The Israeli interceptors committed in response: RO-3 batteries for high-altitude engagements, David Sling systems for mid-tier threats, and Iron Dome radars pulled into a role they were never optimized to fill, cost between $40,000 and $60,000 per round. That comparison initially appears favorable to the defender at the individual engagement level. It does not favor the defender when the salvo density of 1,050 missiles in 4 coordinated waves overwhelms the magazine reload cycle that combat conditions impose on the most capable defensive architecture in the region. The first wave forced immediate commitment of every available interceptor magazine. By the time the second wave of 300 missiles crossed the border, Israeli fire control teams were already executing emergency reload protocols requiring 28 to 38 minutes per cycle under combat conditions. The third and fourth waves arrived before those cycles could complete. 8% of the buried vaults remained intact in the first 50 minutes after impact. Iran expended approximately $680 million in missiles and launch operations. Israel lost the functional equivalent of $22 billion in destroyed bullion, irreplaceable wartime currency, and compromised strategic wealth reserves. 680 million, 22 billion. That ratio is not a tactical imbalance. It is a structural indictment of the certification framework that built classified underground economic reserves against a threat model that classified warning. It is a structural indictment of the certification framework that built classified underground economic reserves against a threat model that classified warning reports had explicitly identified as inadequate, while the adversary that was going to exploit the gap was accumulating the geospatial collection it needed to do so. But here is the dimension that the official communications apparatus is most carefully engineering language to prevent from being examined clearly. Because the exchange ratio is the visible part. The targeting methodology is the part that makes the overnight operation not just a catastrophe, but a paradigm. And it is the part whose implications extend to every government whose economic warfighting reserves are protected under the same threat model assumption the overnight operation invalidated. The targeting package that enabled sub-7-meter accuracy against 10 classified underground facilities did not require human intelligence penetration of Israeli security networks. It did not require classified signals collection. It did not require any collection method whose sophistication Israeli counterintelligence operations would have detected and disrupted before a usable package could be assembled. It required commercial satellite imagery purchased through layered brokers in Southeast Asia, refined by Iranian geospatial teams using algorithms openly available on academic repositories, and cross-referenced with thermal signatures from routine commercial overflights that recorded the distinctive heat patterns of climate control exhaust vents, power substation footprints, and ventilation shaft configurations at each targeted facility. Underground economic reserve infrastructure generates distinctive thermal signatures in commercial infrared imagery. The climate control systems required to maintain vault environmental conditions, temperature stability, humidity management, atmospheric controls, produce heat exhaust profiles at ventilation points that are consistent, measurable, and distinguishable from surrounding mountain terrain in commercial satellite data whose resolution is sufficient for targeting purposes. The facilities were classified. Their climate control exhaust profiles were not. We had warned them in classified assessments and flag officer briefings and exercise after action reports. We warned that the very environmental management systems we built into the underground reserves to protect the physical integrity of the bullion and currency stockpiles inside them would provide thermal targeting signatures to any adversary patient enough to accumulate the commercial satellite imagery whose cross-referencing with synthetic aperture radar passes would refine those signatures into precision aim-point coordinates. The warning was the straightforward engineering conclusion that any geospatial analysis team would derive from the thermal emission profiles of facilities operating the specific climate control equipment those reserves employed. Iran derived it, Israel filed the report. The thermal exhaust profiles of 10 gold bullion war reserves continued broadcasting their locations through commercial overflights until 1,050 Salman missiles had been programmed against them. We hardened air bases, command centers, and underground missile silos with billions of dollars, but left our national gold war reserves sitting in facilities protected by little more than concrete walls and hope. That sentence comes from an internal IDF economic warfare after action memorandum recovered in the immediate follow-up. Written by professionals who had spent careers building the economic warfighting architecture whose destruction they were now accounting for in damage assessments. It requires no elaboration. The honest professional conclusion it contains is the conclusion that the official communications apparatus will never produce in any public briefing about the same events. But here is what I need to tell you before we go further. Because the targeting methodology revelation is the part that the official narrative most urgently needs you to miss. And the implication that follows from it extends beyond the overnight destruction of Israeli gold reserves to every nation whose economic warfighting infrastructure is protected under the same commercial thermal signature threat model gap. Every underground economic reserve. Every classified strategic wealth storage facility. Every national currency stockpile or precious metal reserve buried beneath hardened infrastructure and certified as protected under the assumption that adversary targeting requires classified collection capability. All of them generating thermal signatures through their climate control systems. All of them providing precision targeting solutions to any adversary patient enough and technically competent enough to accumulate and cross-reference commercial satellite imagery against those signature profiles. The threat is not abstract. The collection methodology is not sophisticated in the sense that requires pure competitor industrial capacity. It requires commercial satellite subscriptions, open-source geospatial algorithms, and the patience to build the collection over months until the thermal signature cross-referencing produces targeting accuracy whose sub-7-meter precision against underground classified infrastructure the overnight operation confirmed. This is why the overnight destruction of 10 Israeli gold bullion war reserves is personally relevant to every person whose national security depends on a government whose economic warfighting capacity is protected by underground storage infrastructure certified under the same threat model assumption, and that is most of them. If the commercial thermal signature revelation just changed how you understand the overnight operation, subscribe right now. Leave a comment below telling me which country's strategic economic reserve infrastructure you think is most exposed to the commercial thermal signature targeting methodology the overnight operation validated. Every comment helps this analysis reach the people whose defense and finance establishments need to confront the threat model gap the overnight strike confirmed. Subscribe and stay with me through the personal dimension, because the strategic analysis alone cannot carry the weight of what happened to the people who were inside those vaults when the sky filled with inbound tracks. Colonel Leah Goldman, a senior strategic reserves logistics officer whose career I have tracked through unclassified channels for nearly 19 years, was conducting a routine overnight inventory shift inside one of the affected underground vaults when the first wave arrived. Her final logged transmission described technicians still verifying gold bar serial numbers, confident in the mountain overhead and the layered defenses beyond. Then the roof shifted, and the lights went out. She survived with injuries that will require months of rehabilitation. The personnel around her did not all share that outcome. Their families continue to wait for full confirmation even now. Those families did not participate in the procurement decisions that certified 10 gold bullion war reserves against an inadequate threat model whose inadequacy had been documented in warning reports that the institutional machinery converted to archived files. They will bear the cost of those decisions in the most direct and irreversible way that the gap between institutional warning and institutional action produces. That personal weight is the one that balance sheets and strategic assessments do not capture, but that honest operational accounting cannot omit. The people performing routine inventory duties in those vaults at 0431 that April morning were there because an institutional certification process had told their chain of command that those facilities were adequately protected against the threats that the next conflict would realistically deploy. The certification was wrong. The warning reports had documented that it was wrong, and the families waiting for confirmation are the specific human consequence of the distance between the archived warning and the procurement action the warning demanded. Now, let me tell you about the dimension that extends the overnight operations consequences beyond Israeli warfighting capacity and into the foundational assumptions of economic deterrence doctrine globally. Because this is where the overnight operation stops being a catastrophe and starts being a precedent. And the implications of that precedent are what Russia and China are already extracting and applying. Russia's extraction from the overnight operation is being processed through the Western military district planning apparatus, with the institutional focus of an establishment that has long studied the role of economic reserve infrastructure destruction in the opening hours of high-intensity conflict against NATO adversaries. The strike validated the precision mass-fire doctrine for fixed strategic reserve suppression, whose operational concept Russian contingency planning had developed for European theater application, but had not previously seen confirmed in live-fire conditions against Western-certified hardened economic infrastructure. The 1st Guards Tank Army is updating operational planning for analogous applications against NATO forward economic infrastructure hubs along the Baltic and Eastern European sectors. The specific recalibration targets launched to impact timing windows reduced to under 30 minutes using road-mobile solid fuel systems whose guidance package refinement the overnight operations penetration performance data directly informs. Procurement adjustments in the 30 days following the incident include a 16% increase in orders for enhanced guidance packages on related Russian systems. The parameter the overnight operation confirmed, the ability to neutralize strategic economic reserves before any relocation protocol can be executed, is the parameter whose validation Russian planning for NATO economic infrastructure suppression in European contingency scenarios most urgently required. China's extraction operates through a framework whose primary geographic application involves Taiwan Strait and South China Sea contingency scenarios, but whose economic infrastructure destruction logic is structurally identical. The PLA rocket force has revised operational parameters for striking underground strategic economic storage facilities across the first island chain in direct response to the overnight operation's demonstrated 8% intact vault survival rate against 10 Israeli facilities operating under Western hardening certification standards. The DF-16 and DF-17 brigades are simulating salvo sizes scaled to the observed Israeli event, emphasizing volume and commercial thermal signature targeting methodology over active collection systems. The specific operational concept being refined is the opening hours destruction of Taiwan's strategic economic reserves, the gold bullion stockpiles, the foreign currency reserves, the precious metal holdings, whose operational continuity determines how long Taiwan's economy can sustain warfighting capacity without external resupply, before those assets can be dispersed to secondary holding locations. Survivability assumptions for Allied strategic economic reserve infrastructure have been adjusted downward in PLA internal modeling. Commercial satellite providers report increased encrypted high-resolution tasking traceable to PLA entities, concentrated on underground economic storage facilities across Taiwan and Allied Pacific deployment areas. That collection signature is the observable intelligence expression of an establishment that has moved from lesson extraction to active pre-strike collection preparation for primary theater application. But here is what I need you to understand about why the economic reserve targeting dimension is strategically distinct from the military infrastructure targeting that most conflict analysts focus on. Destroying military infrastructure degrades a nation's ability to fight. Destroying economic war reserves degrades a nation's ability to sustain fighting. The distinction matters because military infrastructure can be partially reconstituted through Allied resupply on operational timescales. Strategic economic reserves represent accumulated national wealth whose physical destruction cannot be reconstituted through any external mechanism on any timeline shorter than years of accumulation. $22 billion in gold bullion and strategic currency reserves does not have a procurement replacement pathway. It has an accumulation replacement pathway. And the accumulation timeline, the years of national saving, international market operations, and reserve management that produces strategic economic depth, is the specific resource that the overnight operation destroyed alongside the physical vaults that contained it. This is the dimension of the overnight operation whose implications are most personally relevant to every person watching this whose government maintains strategic economic reserves. Not because your country's reserves are necessarily facing the same threat profile as Israel's, but because the commercial thermal signature targeting methodology that enabled sub-7 meter accuracy against 10 classified Israeli underground facilities is applicable to every underground strategic economic reserve that generates distinctive climate control thermal exhaust profiles in commercial satellite imagery, which is the defining characteristic of every underground strategic economic reserve that maintains the environmental controls required to preserve the physical integrity of its contents. The threat model gap, the overnight operation confirmed, is not Israeli specific. It is infrastructure characteristic specific. And the infrastructure characteristic it exploits, climate control thermal exhaust signatures, is present in the underground economic reserve architecture of every nation that buries strategic wealth in environmentally controlled underground facilities certified under the assumption that adversary targeting requires classified collection capability. 3 additional nations have already initiated public recalibrations. Saudi Arabia has fast-tracked procurement of advanced precision strike systems from Chinese partners, citing protection needs for its own strategic reserve nodes near sensitive borders and explicitly referencing the 10 Israeli vaults in the procurement justification documentation. The procurement arithmetic is the same arithmetic every finance ministry and defense establishment performed simultaneously after the overnight operations results became visible through satellite imagery and classified assessments. If the most hardened gold bullion war reserve network in the Middle East achieved 8% intact vault survival against a precision saturation salvo at this cost level, then the protection value of conventional underground reserve certification requires immediate reassessment against the new operational baseline the overnight strike established. Turkey has commissioned fresh vulnerability studies for its forward economic storage facilities along the eastern frontier, with planning documents adopting the overnight Israeli event as the explicit new baseline threat model against which Turkish strategic reserve survivability must be assessed. The specific implication of adopting the overnight strike as a baseline, as Turkey's planning documents now do, is that every existing Turkish underground reserve certification was produced against an inadequate threat model whose operational consequence 10 Israeli vaults now illustrate in terms that no planning document can characterize as theoretical. India has expanded back-channel technical consultations on hardening northern mountain vaults against precision ballistic threats while accelerating domestic solid fuel production timelines. The urgency of those consultations reflects the specific insight the overnight operation delivered to every defense establishment and finance ministry that ran the targeting methodology analysis against its own underground reserve infrastructure. Thermal signature control is not a secondary vault security consideration. It is the primary vulnerability that commercial geospatial collection exploits, and no amount of reinforced concrete, layered blast doors, or EMP shielding addresses it. The certification frameworks for classified underground economic reserves had incorporated physical hardening as the primary protective measure, supplemented by active security systems, the electronic monitoring, the access control, the perimeter detection, that generate their own electromagnetic signatures and compound the thermal vulnerability whose exploitation the overnight operation confirmed. The result is the same circular failure that the overnight operation exposed in other hardened underground infrastructure contexts. The active systems intended to protect the facilities provide the signatures whose collection enables the targeting of those facilities. The petrodollar and international monetary dimensions of the overnight operation tighten the strategic pressure in ways that extend its consequences beyond the immediate Israeli economic warfighting capacity. Gulf states that previously underwrote Israeli qualitative edges through indirect financing are now diversifying procurement streams and hedging commitments. The price of the certification framework being wrong is not confined to the $22 billion in direct losses. It propagates through every financial relationship, every warfighting sustainability calculation, and every allied government's assessment of Israeli economic resilience, whose credibility depends on the strategic reserve architecture the overnight operation reduced to 8% intact vault survival. The global gold market registered the overnight operation's implications before the official damage assessment was complete. When 10 vaults containing national strategic gold bullion reserves are destroyed in 28 minutes, the market signal is not about the quantity of physical gold. The global gold supply dwarfs any single national reserve's contribution. The signal is about the doctrine it proves. The doctrine that classified strategic economic reserves are reachable by any adversary with the patience to accumulate commercial satellite thermal signature data and the engineering competence to convert it to targeting accuracy. That doctrine signal propagates through every finance ministry, every central bank strategic reserve management function, and every national security establishment whose economic warfighting doctrine is built on the assumption that strategic reserves are protected by the difficulty of finding and targeting them. The 90-day trajectory following the overnight operation carries 3 observable development paths. Israel will attempt emergency relocation of remaining reserves to secondary and tertiary sites, but the command fractures from the opening minutes will persist for at least 8 weeks while replacement hardened vaults are constructed and new thermal signature control protocols are designed and validated against the commercial collection methodology the overnight operation employed. The physical reconstruction can proceed on an 8-week timeline for the facilities. The thermal signature control protocol redesign, the operational discipline of managing what underground economic infrastructure broadcasts through its climate control exhaust profiles, requires doctrinal restructuring, whose timeline, the procurement cycle, has no mechanism to compress. Iran will release carefully selected imagery, not for celebration, but to communicate with operational precision that the follow-on targeting package for the secondary relocation sites has already been assembled using commercial thermal signature collection against the emergency operations currently underway. The imagery selection will be specific enough to demonstrate that the same methodology that produced sub-7-meter accuracy against 10 classified reserves has been applied to the thermal exhaust profiles of the temporary storage infrastructure whose deployment the overnight operations aftermath required. Washington will convene urgent interagency reviews. Those reviews will generate new vulnerability assessments, updated thermal signature control guidance, and supplemental funding requests whose hardware delivery timelines will be measured against a reconstitution urgency